The main challenge at the moment is the global uncertainty.
China makes up a massive part of Indonesian trade, about 27% of its total.
The Chinese companies are very aggressive and they sort of understand what to do to be able to build business here in Indonesia. Indonesia, developing countries find it quite hard to follow the very strict regulations of the EU, the standards.
Indonesia's central bank has cut interest rates to prop up growth, but the country finds itself at the centre of a global trade drama, with nickel, EU palm oil disputes and shifting supply chains, not to mention a president pursuing austerity and populist programmes at home. So what does it all mean for the world's fourth most populous nation? Joining me now is Krisna Gupta, Senior Fellow at the Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies in Jakarta. Thank you very much for taking the time for us today, Krisna. Firstly, for those who aren't familiar with the Indonesian economy, what would you say are its biggest strengths and challenges right now?
Right. So Indonesia is currently growing quite fine, averaging about 5%. It's getting a little bit slower these days with a Q1 growth, which is about 4.87, but Q2 rebounded to 5.12. So that's a plus. Our labor still are young and very productive. And we have a very government that's very eager to reach 8% growth. As you mentioned, there are several policies that we can discuss later on. But yeah, the global challenge, the main challenge at the moment is the global uncertainty, and lots of global uncertainty that we can discuss a little bit more. But apart from that, I think Indonesia is doing quite okay, and one of the main great destination if you want to sort of diversify from China.
Yeah, so I mentioned this rate cut. So the fact is that they want to fire up growth at the moment, but they have a growth rate which is the envy of many Western nations at the moment. So they are doing pretty well. But let's dig into some more of these kind of policies. So Indonesia is close to sealing a trade deal with the EU. Why has it taken so long to get here?
Yeah, so EU is one of the very strong on standards, right? And Indonesia, developing countries find it quite hard to follow the very strict regulations of the EU, the standards. But I was quite surprised that we finally actually managed to get a deal. I suspect that the global uncertainty, also the need to find new trading partners, is strong on both ends. And I think Indonesians really, also have a very strong aspiration to join the OECD. It's probably willing to at least try their best to follow the rules and regulations required by the EU. So this is actually a perfect time for Indonesia to sort of step up their institutional quality to build growth and reach a higher level of quality of their economic development, I would say.
Yeah, so I spoke to the Indonesian ambassador to Germany a couple of years ago, and he was essentially saying these disputes over palm oil regulations and deforestation that the EU was coming up with were unfair, because now that the EU had reached its level of growth and development, it was now pushing back on other countries which wanted to join it. And another area where there is tension is with China, of course. And China now controls about 3/4 of Indonesia's nickel processing. Now, given that nickel is essential for making electric vehicle batteries, for example, so it's important for these big leaps forward in tech, does that give Beijing too much power in the country?
I wouldn't say so that much, right? Because what's being invested is actually a private company. I can't really say a lot about how close these companies are with Beijing, but you're right that the Chinese companies are very aggressive, and they sort of understand what to do, right? To be able to build business here in Indonesia, whereas the others, not so much. I do think that we need to diversify the source of FDI for sure, to make sure that we can actually get lots of benefit from the downstreaming, right? From the lots of resources that's in Indonesia. These net needs to be very competitive. So I would say Indonesian government would surely do whatever it takes to get more firms from all over the world to actually come and together push the boundaries on the standard of the industry can go.
Yeah, because of course China makes up a massive part of Indonesian trade, about 27% of its total. So it is clearly a relationship that Indonesia wants to preserve, yet at the same time manufacturers in Indonesia have accused Chinese firms of flooding the market with cheap goods. Now that's an accusation that China has received from many other places as well, including the EU, over solar manufacturing, steel or electric cars. Is this a serious issue in Indonesia?
Oh, right. At the moment, yes. So if you notice that complaints against China in the WTO is actually increasing from all over the world, not just here in Indonesia, and their spat with the United States make things a little bit more tricky for Indonesians because now China then moved their goods elsewhere, right? And it is actually at the moment tricky situation, and the Indonesian government's already revised their trade regulations like 3 times in 2 years or something like that, if I'm not mistaken, because of this, right? The flood of relatively cheap goods. And it is a challenge here in Indonesia, and the government are still doing their best to actually manage that.
Okay, well, you mentioned the US there, so let's touch on that. The tariffs that the US slapped on Indonesia, as it did with many countries around the world. Is this a net negative, or could you actually say that it could even be a benefit for Indonesia as supply chains shift out of China and these big international companies are looking for other places to place their factories or their sourcing of materials at least? Could it be a benefit to Indonesia in the end?
Yeah, right, Daniel. So the first Trump in 2018, I think, brings quite some benefit to ASEAN countries, like countries in the Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. Unfortunately, Indonesia didn't really get too much out of it. But in this second Trump era, I think he also, the US also mentioned about lots of other red tapes that actually quite, I wouldn't say problematic, but make business less certain, right? Like quota restriction or some standards, these kind of things that actually would benefit Indonesian industry if they sort of accommodate some of the USTR reports about Indonesians' regulations. But you're right. I think this is actually potential, not just because of the redirection of trade, but also new opportunities for Indonesia to actually follow a reform for their regulation. Mind you, the Indonesians are among the first to actually get a deal with the Donald Trump presidency, and have a willingness to actually pursue the reform that's needed to accommodate some of the USTR's complaint to Indonesia. As again, I would say once more that actually some of these complaints may actually increase Indonesia's competitiveness in the world.
Yeah, so it looks like that Indonesia said that it's going to drop basically 99% of the tariffs towards the US as a concession in this regard. So it has shifted its policy, certainly in that sense. But then the US has dropped tariffs against Indonesia from 32%, or at least the threat was 32%, to 19% now. So they're already benefiting from that too. And it looks also like this China plus one strategy is already boosting the potential of their factories there, the investment there, the land prices there even. But do you think that even just the threat of this US, these US tariffs made the EU deal much more likely? Do you think that's what pushed them over the line in the end, is that they've got this threat coming from the US side, and so therefore they were looking for friendlier partners and perhaps better the devil you know, and therefore the EU deal came together?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I can only speculate, right? But I'm pretty sure. Now, the thing is, it's not just China, right? US also become unpredictable. So any new partners are really a boon at the moment. And since Indonesia also have aspiration to join the OECD, might as well, right? And as I mentioned, this actually may be able to improve Indonesia's competitiveness and better quality of growth rate. Now that the standards with its Western trading partners can only go up. So I think while at the same time this creates a little bit of uncertainty and all countries that try to manage, probably we will go to a new sort of balance or new equilibrium. I think that each countries talking as outside the US and China is certainly because of that. Because at least now we know that we can't just we can't take for granted, right? The current system, the current deal with the current countries. We need to step up the game.
Okay, well, let's look at domestic policy now. And President Prabowo says that he wants to deliver 8% growth by the end of the decade. That would be a big leap from where they are now. Indonesia is doing very well, around about 5% growth at the moment, but that faltered in the previous quarter. So even that isn't necessarily steady. So would you say that it's a bold but realistic vision or more of an economic fantasy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, lots of my colleagues actually really skeptical about this target, right? And there's no historical. There was a historical precedent where we reached these 8%, but it was somewhere around 90s, which followed with the Asian financial crisis in 1998. So lots of people actually kind of skeptical. But if you try to pursue this with everything you got, then one of the way to do it is to sort of add to the debt, right? To increase the debt either from the government or from the investment vehicles, which Indonesia is very well known for its macroprudence, where we don't really we very keep the debt level to relatively safe. But some others mentioned that this actually helped growth, right? Because we could have more growth if we have more debts. But 1998 sort of makes us a little bit scared of too much debt. So the banks are a little bit, and the government have their fiscal rule intact. Now, as long as this macroprudence is being kept, investors are happy. But there was a moment where the government tried to expand a little bit, and investors are, getting scared a little bit. Some even get out. So if this 8%, I think it's very hard to reach it unless we do a lot of debt, which then make macroprudence a new problem, right? So yeah, to me, as long as the government try to be realistic about it and not putting too much risk on the growth path of Indonesia, then we should probably be fine. But again, these require probably a new sort of source of growth and also new trading partners and things like that. But for sure, business as usual won't probably cut it.
So the president has ordered huge austerity cuts, partially in order to reassure some of those investors who want to see a balanced budget or at least a plan. And so he's stripped about $19 billion from the government budget. What does that mean for ordinary Indonesians in terms of jobs, services, infrastructure?
Right. So the austerity, you're right, that it actually sort of reassure a little bit to investors, but at the same time, Indonesian government's budget is one of the drivers of the economy, right? So the first two quarters actually booked a negative growth for Indonesia's overall economy growth, and negative from the government, right? So the growth of government consumption actually negative in the first two quarters. The quarter one lodged a less than 5% growth. So definitely it's being felt. And if you read the Indonesian news at the moment, there's a lot of job seekers that seems to be like in the up, right? We have more job seekers these days compared to last year's. Thing is, in Indonesia, the statistic for unemployment is a little bit easy. So as long as you work in the first week by more than 1 hour, then you counted as not jobless. So while the Indonesian statistic at the moment shows reduction of unemployment, but we really have to dig a little bit deeper on how much of those are actually informal, and the total wage and total hours spent working needs also to be looked at. For the services, it's not being felt too much, but one of the biggest cut is in the infrastructure, right? So the building of infrastructure is probably going to be slow a little bit, unless, of course, Indonesia's SOEs manage to find money to move their construction companies' SOEs to build more infrastructures, but it probably won't come from the government.
Okay, yet at the same time, of course, Prabowo is spending vast sums on a free meals program for school children. However, it's very expensive at $28 billion annually. Is it merely populist, as critics say, or is it necessary to help the poorest citizens? And we've had some media reports talking about that it misdirects resources to, let's say, school children instead of infants who would benefit from having those regular nutritious meals, or that it arbitrarily prioritizes the pure amount of meals served instead of the nutritional quality. What's your assessment on this?
Right. So this is one of the big contentions, right? Because it eats up lots of Indonesia's budget. In lots of other countries, the free meal program actually are also conducted, right? So we're not the first. And some of them actually provide a positive outcome for the children. So that's one. So in principle, this is actually a good program. However, of course, devil's in the details. It's all in the implementation. So one criticism that I know is that because it's so big, right, and it requires lots of logistics, different meals, proteins and carbohydrates, things like that. The rollout, the fastest happened in the richest provinces, right, richest countries, so where the infrastructure is already there. So this, some people said, is actually kind of regressive, because then you have a transfer towards a region that actually quite better off, because these regions that have a good infrastructures are actually quite better off, and probably the regions that don't need the meal program. Whereas the more needed one is, a little bit left behind, because they need to build up the institutional capacity to go there. And especially those places, it's probably not feasible for businesses to come in there. And secondly, we also actually have some other proper programs, and some people are afraid that actually the free meal program cuts the budget for these proper programs, which already have decades of infrastructure building, right, institutional capacity, that probably we better off just put money more on these old programs instead of making a new one. But the government seems to really eager to continue this. This is one of the Prabowo Subianto's main program. And this is very popular. Lots of people, can say it on top of their head if you ask what's the Prabowo's main program, and everyone will just say the free meal. So I wouldn't bet on it being stopped, but the government really need to step up, especially because the rollout is not fast enough, right? I mentioned a little bit about the government consumption, and because these program eats up lots of the government budget, if you roll this out quite slowly, then the government budget that's actually entered the economy of Indonesia is kind of slow, right? And because this is so big, it has to roll out faster than this. I hope they can do it, but my God, it's probably hard to do.
Yeah, I think the main criticism is that there are a lot of programs that he's implemented that sound very good in headlines, but like you said, the devil is in the detail. So let's look at Danantara, Indonesia's new $900 billion sovereign wealth fund. It reports directly to the president and has little oversight. Are you concerned that this money could be used for political favors, for example?
All right. Danantara is also, I think, an elephant in the room, right? It's because Indonesia's main growth drivers, Indonesia have been trying to increase investment from the previous president, Joko Widodo, and has not been successful as we wanted, right? And Danantara was supposed to be the panacea of this, right? A big, bold and can directly channel money to projects. Indonesia is contentious with being places where interest rate is pretty high, and not so much money comes to actually making projects. So Danantara sort of bridged this market failure with the hope that the money can actually goes to project. Danantara also pitched to be a free from the government, and be very professional, strictly looking for gain, right? However, as you mentioned, the leader of Danantara is actually also Ministry of Investment, so that's already kind of a little bit scary. And it also they also have 4 biggest banks in Indonesia among their ranks. And we've seen some news about where they're going to invest, and some of them actually seems to be like a government program. So it's not really thus free from the government intervention, right? Some programs like coal, the gas from the coal. People say it's not commercially viable, but they still trying to do it anyway. So lots of and lastly, lots of the announcement of investment is not clear to me yet. Probably I just not read enough, but we're not sure where they actually put their money, not yet at least. So yeah, I think concerns are there, and it's even more because the Dantara is so big, and among them are 4 biggest Indonesian SOE banks, right? Thing is, we've already seen what happens with the Indonesian construction company when the government asks them to build infrastructure that's not commercially viable using debts, so using SOE debts, right? So it's not government debt, but SOE debt. And now they're having a problem with their balance sheet. It was just a construction company, so we at least can breathe less hardly, breathe a little bit okay-ish. But Danantara is so big, right? If it happens to Danantara, then yeah, it's really scary. But I hope that doesn't happen. We'll see.
Yeah, the CEO is not just the investment minister, as you mentioned, but also the former campaign manager for Prabowo. So there's a lot of close ties there, let's say. So all eyes will be on that. But this does kind of lead into a broader question. As Indonesia is so resource rich, why has it been so hard to turn that natural wealth into broad prosperity? It does have the growth rate, but it doesn't have the broader prosperity that you might expect for a country that is so rich in natural resources.
Yeah, so country with rich natural resources are quite plenty, right? And as you probably know already, some of these countries are not very successful in increasing their value chain. But for one, Indonesia is also a big country, right? So if you calculate sort of the resource rent available in the country divided by their population, it's not actually so big. But moreover, the Indonesia's overall business climate isn't great. This has been quite criticism from a long time ago. And sometimes because of the resource rich, we sort of, okay, we have resources, so we can lay back a little bit, something like that, right? The economy is going to be fine as long as we can sell our natural resources. And the incentive to move away from that, it's not great, right? Because our safe haven is the resource rich. And because of the natural resource main sort of productive main factor of production is actually the land itself, right? Your permit to actually dig the place, right? And as long as you get that permit, it's actually not so hard to generate income as long as the world price is okay. So there is a little incentive to actually innovate and create more complex products, because as long as you get that permit, you can start producing, right? So resources goes to getting that permit. And this is not always easy to grasp the way to get this permit. Let's say that. But yeah, sometimes resource rich actually makes us complacent and less likely to try to innovate, unfortunately. But as I mentioned, now situation's changed, and it seems like the government tries to woo the US with potentially do their regulations and make things more business friendly. So I hope at least at that regards, Indonesia starts to improve.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a common problem that affects a lot of countries with large amounts of natural resources. The so-called resource curse, though, whether it is truly a curse is actually open to question. But certainly, Indonesia wants to push its resource sovereignty when it comes to all of these other countries that are vying for influence in Indonesia. So with the US, the EU, and China all pulling Indonesia in different directions, or at least attempting to, let's say, can Jakarta really balance those relationships without being squeezed?
Right. So lots of my colleagues actually say that Prabowo Subianto is a person who is more external friendly, say, external savvy compared to the previous one, Joko Widodo. So he knows how to speak with these leaders. He has his own way of doing this, and he's a good talker and good conversationist. So at least in that regard, he knows how to manage these relationships. But yeah, I mean, Indonesia seems to always try their best to stand in the middle and not being pulled in each direction. So that's probably I'm looking at that potentially to be the case still, right? And yeah, but yeah, how these three regions, US, EU, China, how they talk to each other, and how they approach Indonesia is going to be crucial. And I think we're going to see more details at the moment. But at the moment, Indonesia really tries to balance these three. I hope it's going to be a success story, but we'll have to see, because even these three countries you mentioned, US, EU, China, themselves are probably thinking how to engage with Indonesia better. And yeah, I think Indonesia stands in the great place, one of the biggest countries in Southeast Asia. Definitely these three places have to talk to Indonesia. So at least we're in an okay position, and we'll see what we're going to do about it.
Yeah, so Indonesia has plenty of things that makes other countries jealous, with its decent growth rate and its resource riches as well. So how it does in the future will all depend on how that's managed. Krisna Gupta, thank you very much for your analysis on that. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.